It is Tuesday, the 19th of November, 2019. This is David Gauci, and on behalf of Dave Nagel and me, I welcome you to the 12th talk in the Business and Energy series of Forum 2100. This will be the first of the talks in Forum 2100 that addresses the military, which turns out to be an important consumer when it comes to energy. Quickly, let me remind you of the format of the session. In one moment, I'm going to be introducing our guest for today, Dr. Paul Sullivan, who will speak for 18 minutes. Thereafter, we shall field questions from you, the audience, for 10 minutes. Please do submit a question if one comes to mind, and you can do this at any point during the talk using the chat function in Zoom, and I shall do my best to synthesize the questions to present them to Dr. Sullivan for his response. We are recording the session, and we will make this available to you and all of the public afterwards. Dr. Paul Sullivan has an extensive experience with military planners and understands how to deal with the challenges of operational energy, both in conflict and training contexts, sometimes in remote and often hostile locations. Dr. Sullivan has been advising senior leadership in government and the military on economic, energy, water, extremism, and a number of other topics. And since July of 1999, he has served as a full professor on the faculty of the National Defense University, where he has taught economics and analytics about the energy industry and then all of the implications that follow from that. He also serves as an adjunct professor of security studies at Georgetown University, where he has taught classes on global energy and international security, which includes analyses of energy and security issues for various places around the world. Dr. Sullivan, welcome to Forum 2100. You are speaking to an audience that spans 10 time zones. You can take yourself off mute. And the floor is now yours.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you might be at. First of all, I have to give a caveat that these are my opinions alone, do not represent those of the National Defense University, DoD, or any other institution I might be involved with. Also, the sources for these slides can be found on the slides. This is an unclassified presentation. But there will be a lot of interesting stuff here. Take a look at this slide right here. Take a look at the top left where you have these fighter aircraft. These sort of fighter aircraft can burn as much as 3,700 to 5,200 pounds of fuel an hour, which means that they don't have a lot of range because just looking at the size of the fuel tanks, they really can't go far. We're talking about 1,200 nautical miles to 1,500 nautical miles, or even 500 nautical miles, depending on how many weapons they're carrying, what their maneuvers are, the weather, and so forth. So you really need to have a tanker to help them go from point A to point B to drop the bombs or do whatever they're doing at the time, surveillance and so forth. This also applies to helicopters and to ships. Most Navy ships cannot make it across the Pacific. They need to be refueled at least once, unless we have the nuclear aircraft carriers that need refueling after about 5 years or so. Another part of what I'll be talking about is the security issue of moving the fuel. 1 out of 8 casualties in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, if you take a look at that picture of the convoy on fire, was because of moving fuel. So obviously less fuel being used by the end users like the aircraft and the ships and the helicopters will mean less movement of the fuel and more security for our people. Over here to the right-hand side, there is a gas diesel and ship that actually produces its own electricity for its fuel system. That's something new coming around the bend. This is a howitzer fueled by solar cells with a battery attached. This right here is dropping fuel in Afghanistan out of a C-17. The actual total cost of that fuel in Afghanistan to the end user, of course, they never saw that. They weren't charged it in the field in the forward operating base, was over $400 a gallon. Another aspect of operational energy is something like this. What you're looking at is the legs of a uniform of a Marine that can actually produce his electricity with movement in the uniform, often carrying around solar shells and also using kinetic energy and kinetic movements to produce that. This is the overall use of energy in the United States. Why I'm putting this up is to give you a sense of where the DoD fits into all of this. Look over here, this is quadrillion British thermal units. To get a sense of a British thermal unit, those of you who remember Ollie North, he used to have a wooden matchstick and burn it down to his fingers to show how tough he was. That's essentially a British thermal unit, and the US uses about 100 quadrillions of those each year. The defense agencies use about 1% of all the fuel in the United States. And DoD is the largest user of energy, single user of energy in the entire world. And the Air Force is the biggest user of energy in DoD. Notice, however, how it's dropping down as we're taking troops out of the field. This is the surge in Afghanistan. And before this, we had the upsurge in war in Afghanistan and Iraq. This gives you another sense of where DoD fits into all of this. Look at the size of the defense energy bill compared to all the other services. The closest one is the Postal Service, because of course they need a lot of gasoline. DoD doesn't use a lot of gasoline. The biggest use is jet fuel for the Air Force, but also there are jets in the Army and in the Navy. Diesel fuel, there's a lot there, mostly because most of the big Navy ships use diesel fuel marine, DFM or A76 in NATO terms, to drive those ships. Diesel is very energy intensive. Gasoline is here. For facilities, that's more on the bases here. A lot of electricity is used, natural gas and so forth. Now, operational energy is different from installation energy. Operational energy focuses on military deployments across the full spectrum of missions, including special forces, the surge I mentioned, but it's also direct support of military deployments and everything that's connected with that, and training and support of readiness for the military deployments, some things that might be happening at Fort Bragg or Parris Island. Now, operational energy is 70% of DoD's energy use. 30% is installation. And if you read through this quickly, and I'm sure they're going to supply the slides connected with the online stuff, our use of fuel has gone down, much like the previous slide, and the cost of that fuel has also gone down because of the decline in the price of oil. And a big part of this, of course, the efficient management of fuel means fewer full fuel convoys and also fewer of those tanker movements to get out to the ships and the Air Force planes. Now, the expenditures went down here because the price of oil went down. Of course, the major price of fuel, if it's oil-based, is the price of oil. Look at the dominance of the Air Force, how important the Navy is, the Army's down here, yet this is a massive amount of fuel. The Marine Corps is up here. They don't use a lot of it, but they base many of their operations on the Navy and sometimes work also with the Air Force and the Army. Operational, again, is mostly Air Force. There's Navy, US Marine Corps is this tiny sliver, and then the Army. Most of this is overseas right now because our operations are mostly overseas. Installation, I'm not going to get too much into, but it's a significant part, 30% of our energy use. And you can see that drop in the price. As the rest of the United States is using more and more fuel, the military is using less and less. That should be a lesson in trying to get beyond the myths of what's going on here. Now, what does energy do for the military? You have to have energy for command and control and communications and cyber issues. You have to run those computers and the cooling for those computers. If you're taking a look at servers throughout the United States, about 13% of our electricity goes to cooling those servers. Lethality. There are actual weapons that are energy-based. You have specific lasers or rail guns that use a lot of energy. And some of those ships use the same source of energy to run themselves. So they have to know how much energy to use for the weapon and also for running. It takes a lot of math. Endurance, getting from point A to point B. Payload, how to get the stuff out to the troops. Expeditionary operations, where people are in the field in their forward operating bases, they're going to need energy. batteries, fuel, whatnot. In agility, you need energy. Awareness, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Lots of energy is used. Power projection, one of the real sources of the element of power of military for the United States is our ability to project our power throughout the world because of lift in the Air Force and the distances our Navy ships can go. And also survivability. If you don't have fuel, you're dead in the water or you're dead in the land. A good example of that is when Rommel ran out of fuel in the north of Libya. That had to do with the SAS attacking one of his fuel depots. But also, a curious thing, there was an oil field under Rommel's tanks as he was running out of oil that had 5 billion barrels in it. He didn't know about it. I guess many people would be speaking German today if he knew about it and had a refinery nearby. We all know about the supply chain for this energy. There are all kinds of things that people can do to this supply chain, particularly our enemies. You can go against access for this. You can area denial this through weapons or politics. You can use cyber threats, space threats even. That's arguing for the Space Command. Political and economic influence, you can stop our ships from going in certain areas or allowing our ships to get to the fuel. All kinds of people and organizations, both nation and non-nation states, try what they can to stop us from getting fuel when necessary. And the worst situation you want as a military is to have many of your fuel depots and sources of fuel in an area that may not be accessible. What are the vulnerabilities? Enemy force interdiction, essentially blowing up the fuels, getting at the pipelines, choke points like the Straits of Hormuz, where 19 million barrels a day of oil goes through. This is not as important to us as it used to be, because now we're the largest producer of oil and natural gas in the world. Hooah, as the Army would say. We are amazing on this right now, but still at the same time, we need some of certain fuels from certain parts of the world because of the need for specific types of fuel. Man-made disasters, natural disasters. If you have an earthquake near a fuel depot, or if you have a fire on the Houston Ship Channel, or an attack on the Houston Ship Channel, Houston Ship Channel is where we get 60% of our jet fuel, 30% of our gasoline, and 30% of our diesel. If the bad guys figured that out, we'd be in serious trouble. State-owned enterprises, that's another part of it. Maybe they'll shut down our access to this. Cyber and SCADA. SCADA is an informationally intensive way of controlling the pipelines, even the ships. If you attack a SCADA system inside of a tanker, you can actually scuttle that ship. And one of the main problems with some of our energy shipping is the use of very weak passwords like password or 1234. Price volatility, if the price of oil goes up, that affects the budgets. The lines of communications are very long for war for the United States. It's not like Napoleon to Moscow, but think of the distances from the Houston Ship Channel to Iran right now. And support asset vulnerability, most particularly tankers. I can't get into that too much, but tankers in the air and tankers at sea are absolutely required to make sure that our ships and aircraft can maneuver and can get from point A to point B without landing in the ocean. Less fuel means more fight. This goes back to, let's say, the time of Winston Churchill when he shifted from coal-based ships to oil-based ships to take some of the people shoveling the coal into the engine room and being on deck and fighting. We have more driverless and pilotless logistics and fuel transport than in the past. There's a significant complexity of math in the energy logistics in the military. A lot of the sort of folks that are needed now for the energy logistics are not the strong arms to push the coal into the furnace, but the math majors from MIT to figure out how to get this stuff from point A to point B. And if anyone has worked in an electricity utility or in a big oil company, you know how important math is. If we use fuel better, we have less casualties. We have less convoys, less people getting burned. There's a strong relationship between fuel consumption and casualty rates. The less people we have out in the mountains of Afghanistan on one-lane roads and convoys full of fuel, the less of those people will be in the face of danger. Military commanders, colonels, lieutenants, whomever have to constantly negotiate between the vulnerability of getting the fuel to where it's needed and fuel efficiency, but that can be worked together. The more fuel efficient an operation is, the less vulnerable it is to move the fuel from where it is to the operation itself. Fuel efficiency can save lives. This is one of the most important things in the military right now, just not in the US, but also throughout the world. If you're efficient, you can save lives. They can allow more warfighters, and that's not just Churchill and the coal. This has to do with people on the ships today. And for a Marine, if any Marines are in the audience, think of how many times you were carrying tens of pounds of batteries that you ended up throwing into the desert. If you can recharge those batteries, or if the batteries hold the power more and store the energy longer, you can be faster and lighter, more dexterous, and you can fight the battle without having all that heavy pack. Fuel efficiency cuts the need for tankers for air, sea, and land, and cuts that logistics complexity, which can bring our people at risk. We are going to be in another war. There's no doubt about that. This is just the nature of life. And the more efficient we can have our energy use and fuel movements, and the safer this can be, and the safer our people can be, then our military can be more lethal, it can be safer, more secure, and we can be more fuel efficient, which also affects the budget. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Sullivan, thank you very much. Just a few questions that do come to mind. The first one would be, considering your background, which is quite impressive, you have been doing this for decades, and you also obviously have knowledge and have had the experience of interacting with people in different parts of the world and in different militaries around the world. Could you possibly elaborate a little bit more on whether what you've just presented is so US focused, or how do the other militaries around the world actually stack up, or are they looking at this in the same way?
Well, I would think that most of them would have to look at this in the same way, because the fuel use in a Russian aircraft of similar variety, with similar weapons being carried and similar maneuver and similar distances to travel, would be fairly close to ours. But the F-35 is extremely energy inefficient. In many ways, the use of energy in the F-35 is a bit of a failure of the technology of the aircraft. If you want to go out with such a sophisticated aircraft on a sortie and you have to refuel 2 and 3 times, that gets in the way. But certainly our NATO allies, using our aircraft, the F-16, the F-15, similar ships, similar vehicles on the ground, they all face this issue, but not to the extent that we do, because our DoD is by far the largest military user of energy in the world. China uses much less per soldier, clearly. They don't have the sophisticated aircraft, although they're stealing the technology and heading in that direction. And the British have a much smaller Army, Navy, and Air Force. But still, when they take a look at their Army, Navy, and Air Force, they have to consider these issues. How long can their aircraft go without refueling? How many times does it have to connect with the tanker? How long can one of their destroyers go? During the Falklands War, I'm sure the British were biting their nails on how they're going to refuel all of those destroyers and frigates heading to South America from the UK or from wherever they started. So the issues are the same. There'll be differences because of technology and the sophistication of fuel infrastructure and fuel supply chains. But pretty much every modern developed military in the world has to face many of these same issues.
Well, along perhaps pushing ahead with this issue, you've painted quite a picture about the vulnerabilities that militaries face as associated with fuel and energy in general. And given in particular, the significant requirement for aviation that you have actually illustrated right here on this slide with respect to fuel use. To what extent are biofuels and renewables competitive aviation substitutes for jet fuel? Is this in the innovation path right now?
It was much more in the innovation path in the past, particularly because of a Navy secretary during the Obama administration who wanted to have the great green fleet using biofuels for destroyers and others. However, the price of the fuel ended up to be many times, almost $26 to $30 a gallon. And these are the kind of ships that go through 1,000 gallons an hour. So the difference in the price from, let's say, $2 a gallon to $26 a gallon can really throw off a budget. I was with a senior figure in the Air Force when the day when a B-2 bomber was tested on butanol. We were having lunch at NDU, and the report I heard was it worked well, but the landing gear didn't work, so the congressman didn't like the idea that the landing gear didn't work, therefore it was a failed test. Well, this is Washington. But is it a possibility that we could use mixed fuels? There are many engines within aircraft in the Air Force and the Army and others that use multiple fuels in their switchers, where the pilot or the navigator or others can switch between fuels. But so far as I know, we haven't been able to perfect biofuels or alternative fuels that have the same efficiency, the same reliability, and the same cost. And of course, that's important. You can test this stuff at peacetime and listen about it over lunchtime at a nice peaceful fort in Washington, D.C. But when you're in the middle of a battle, you want to make sure the fuel is there and ready to go, and you're not going to run out and the engines won't get clogged up. There's a lot of testing going on in this. It's very important that we move in this direction for many reasons. But I can't see oil-based fuels declining rapidly in the militaries at any time. It's a matter of culture, meaning it's a range issue, range anxiety issue. There are not going to be a lot of electric vehicles going into an operation that's dangerous unless people are absolutely sure that they have a long enough range. Because it's not like going shopping with the kids and your dogs to the local Whole Foods. And if you kind of run out of electricity and you weren't expecting it, you can plug in the garage of the Whole Foods. You can't do that in a military theater in many places unless you drop them from an aircraft charging stations, which I guess is possible. And a big part of this is developing new battery systems. And Stanford and Berkeley, MIT and others are looking into this. Batteries are going to be a vital part of the military in the future. Not just in cars and radios and transportation, all that, but also for ships. Ships use a ton of batteries. And also, if you're using batteries like this right here, if the cursor can be seen by those watching, you can use batteries for weapons, howitzers. Who would have thought of that 20 years ago? When I started in the field, I never would have thought about that. That's back in 1985 at Oak Ridge. Would I have thought about this? Yes. During World War II, this stuff happened. But I thought about the massive amounts of fuel being used in aircraft. That was a problem then. The more sophisticated our aircraft become, the more fuel they use, which is kind of backwards. But you can become more efficient. And one of the major problems and arguments in DC has to do with these tankers. If you don't have enough tankers, efficient tankers and reliable tankers, you're not going to have that lift. You're not going to have that strategic distance to work with. And you're also going to put your pilots at risk.
Right. So actually, the question was actually focused primarily on aviation, but you've expanded it. Thank you very much for that. But there is another issue, which is a need for electricity, sort of generally, in support of military operations. Is there any innovation path associated with that in theater, let's say, that is using renewable sources of energy?
Oh, yes, quite a bit. And actually, the Marines are kind of ahead of the game on this one, looking at operational energy for forward operating bases, using solar, not so much wind. Another reason behind that is if you have a diesel powered generator, which was often the case for the Marines and others in forward operating bases, they vibrate a lot. And the enemy can hear that. And it can hear it from a distance. It's sort of like listening to the train track and figure out how long it is until the train will arrive. If you hear this rumbling at night in a no wind evening and so forth, you can figure out where the Americans are. But if you have solar with batteries and you can hide them appropriately with camouflage, and those batteries have a lot of hold and they can be recharged many hundreds, if not thousands of times, this is a way to get around the diesel problem. Another way to get around this is to have biofuels, where you can actually grow those fuels in a forward operating base where you're at. Of course, that means the forward operating base is going to be there through the agricultural cycles, or you could have the biofuels dropped in. But then again, you get right into the problem of the convoy safety and so forth. But the real issue is the efficient use of the energy, electricity, fuels, whatnot, at the end use for transportation, for weapons and so forth. And also for clinics and hospitals and lights being on it, for communication and the other things that I mentioned in that circular diagram showing why energy is so important to the military. Electricity is hugely important. Well, you have to see things. But also electricity is used for certain weapons. It's used for certain communication devices. One way the enemy could cause great difficulties for a forward operating base or even here is to attack the energy infrastructure that is attached to the base. One of the arguments that many in the military are giving is we need to be able to have microgrids to separate out these bases from the general grid, just in case there's an electromagnetic burst or there are other attack on the grid. And the grid is fairly unreliable when it comes to the circulation or the sine waves of electricity, because some military equipment needs a lot of stability in the electricity system. And our electricity system, as it is right now, is kind of a dumb grid, and it really doesn't have that stability.
Okay. You mentioned work that was being done at various universities like MIT on batteries, advancing batteries. Is there any formal program that you know of for the military through ARPA or some other agency?
Well, there's ARPA-E, which looks a lot into batteries. Unfortunately, they were zeroed out in their budget last year, but they're still existing. They do some really awesome stuff on super batteries, and what they do is they fund the pie in the sky stuff. It's not the stuff that will be available next year or the year after that. And it's the kind of thing that can make a huge difference, not only in batteries, but also in the entire electricity system and the stability I mentioned. Stanford and the military work together, MIT and the military work together, Caltech and the military work together. A lot of those programs are not public. When they become very important and very effective, what was public often becomes non-public for very good reasons. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on out there. And actually there's a group, or more than one group, trying to figure out a battery that you can shoot at, put a hole in it, and stab it, and it will still work. Wow. Now, for a Marine in the field, that's a pretty good thing. Usually if you shot at a battery, it's gone. Or you stabbed it, it wrecks the internal mechanism of the battery. But if this is a resilient battery to be used in military conflict, that can make a big difference.
One last question, Paul, just to sort of bring this to a closure. But if we reflect on the experience with an agency like NASA, a lot of what was done there, a lot of research advancing, obviously space-related activities. Here you've described a lot of innovation, technological innovation and applications that are in the military context. To what extent can you say some of this is beginning to spill over into industry more generally, and into the general economy?
Industry and DoD often work together on these. The Marine program actually has outreach to industry to ask industry to work on these issues. And they would give some seed money. ARPA-E does the same thing. NASA does the same thing. a lot of the innovations that people listening to this right now, if they don't know it, started in the military. If you have a GPS in your car, which now makes your traveling from, let's say, your house to your child's university, which might be a long distance, and you can have this route set up for you, that's from the military.
Hmm. Paul, thank you very much. We're out of time, but this is fascinating, and I know that there are more questions. I'm sure people are going to want to follow up with you. Just to let everyone know, we will be posting this. We've recorded this. We will be posting it on the Forum 2100 website, and you'll find Paul's contact information there, along with his slides. But it will also be posted on our the Forum 2100 YouTube channel, so you can check it out there as well. So this completes our Business and Energy Talks series for year 2019. On Tuesday, the 21st of January, our next speaker, Professor Greg Nemeth of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, will talk about his recently published book, How Solar Energy Became Cheap, a model for low carbon innovation. He teaches at the University of Wisconsin's Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies, where, among other things, he helps deliver the energy analysis and policy certification program for graduate students from all across the campus. So please join us on the 21st. As always, pass the word, and this is an open forum, so as many people as can be. We now have over 250 people, I think, on the distribution list, reaching all the way around the globe. So let's keep it going. We're very grateful to all of you for joining us today, and wishing you a happy end of the year, happy holidays, and it's not too early to say, wishing you the very best for the next year, 2020. Thanks for joining us. Bye for now.